Crime and punishment in Middle-earth. Today, Húrin will face justice. He will be judged, he will stand trial, and it will be the worst thing that ever happens to the people passing the sentence. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to the third episode in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Doom of Húrin. As we kick things off, Húrin is imprisoned. In the last episode, he was brought before the chieftain of the Woodmen, the Halad of Brethiel, Hardang. And after one thing led to another, he hurled a stool at Hardang's face. Pretty deservedly, really. But the Woodmen were not happy about it, so Hardang's sycophantic friend, and effectively the de facto second-in-command, Captain Avrunk, ordered Húrin be locked in a cave, bound and chained, and put on trial for his violent misdeed. From the perspective of Avrunk and Hardang, this is their opportunity to be rid of Húrin Thalion, and to cement their control over Brethiel for good. However, Húrin is not without any friends. And so, pretty immediately after he's incarcerated, his second cousin, Lord Manthor of the North March, approaches Avrunk and his other second cousin, Hardang, in the Halad's Hall to advocate on Húrin's behalf. But the moment Manthor moves close to Avrunk and Hardang, their previous conversation falls suspiciously silent. Manthor only catches their very last words, in which Avrunk urges that Húrin be put to death immediately. And so, Manthor gives Avrunk and Hardang a piece of his mind. He says, "I have seen you at like sports before, goading an old badger, then having him killed when he bites. Not so swift, Captain Avrunk, nor you, Hardang Halad. The coming of Húrin and his welcome here concerns all the folk, and they shall hear all that is said before any judgment is given. In due time I will return to the marchers, but now I will summon the folk." Manthor demands due process. Now, neither Hardang nor Avrunk are happy about this. A jury and a fair trial and a reasonable verdict would be enormously inconvenient for them, and when Manthor insists upon it, we get a clear idea of just how despicable these other two woodmen are. When Manthor turns to leave, Avrunk seizes his bow and chooses to shoot Manthor right in the back to murder him, here in the Halad's Hall. But Hardang restrains him with just two words: "Not yet." And so Manthor leaves the hall, and he sends messengers far and wide to all the Haladin in Brethiel. The folk must come to Obel Halad. They must partake in the judgment of Húrin Thalion. But Avrunk sends out rumours too, comparing Húrin to some kind of orc chieftain who's working on behalf of Morgoth. And so a great many woodmen make their way to the Ring of Justice to decide the fate of Húrin, to attend Brethiel's 301st folk moot for judgment. The House of Haleth has a culture that's really quite distinct from other Manish cultures in Middle-earth, and we really get to see this with the folk moot. It's not a million miles away from, democracy. Whenever matters of high importance need to be decided among the woodmen, a folk moot is declared. And for a folk moot to be valid, there needs to be at least 500 Haladin present at the moot ring to cast their votes. A white stone for yes, a black stone for no. In the case of Húrin's judgment, nearly 1,000 woodmen gather. But I think it's important to point out, when I say men, I don't mean 1,000 males, I mean 1,000 individuals from the race of men. Tolkien explicitly wrote that among the Haladin, the wives were also summoned to the council and had equal voices with the husbands. On a few separate occasions, we get to see that gender roles within the House of Haleth are nowhere near as rigid as they are in other Middle-earth communities. And it's worth reiterating, of course, that Haleth herself was a woman, with an all-female crew of bodyguards. Anyway, getting back to Manthor, in addition to being a captain, ranger, and marchwarden, he's also a very shrewd lawyer, with a deep understanding of his people's customs. He knows that, according to their law, every prisoner must have a friend, an advocate, I guess what we would call a defense attorney. And so he nominates himself for that task. He becomes the very first person in Brethiel to visit Húrin in his stone cell. And together, they have a very interesting conversation. When Manthor tells Húrin that he comes as a friend, at first, Húrin does not believe him. He claims he has no friends in this land, and he has no intention of pleading before a rabble of woodmen while his ankles remain chained. He would rather slay himself than be sentenced to death by a man without honor, like Hardang. But Manthor sits with Húrin anyway. He offers him food, and he speaks kindly, until, eventually, Húrin looks into Manthor's eyes, and his wrath at last departs him. For the first time in far too long, he has an actually friendly conversation. After finishing their food and drink together, Húrin says to Manthor, "By your voice you have overcome me. Never since the day of dread have I heard any man's voice so fair. Alas, it calls to my mind the voices in my father's house, long ago, when the shadow seemed far away." To which Manthor replies, that may well be, for he reminds Húrin that his grandmother, Hiriel, and Húrin's mother, Hareth, were sisters. Húrin responds, "Then thou art both kin and friend." "But not I alone," Manthor tells him. "We are few and have little wealth, but we too are Edain, and bound by many ties to your people. Your name has been held in honor here." Now, before too long, things are going to get quite ugly. But I want to linger on this moment because it demonstrates there is still some good in Húrin. His mind has been hijacked by Morgoth, but not totally. And it also demonstrates that even among the smallest, humblest, and most isolationist house of the Edain, there is still honor and courage and decency in men like Manthor. However, this wholesome moment is not destined to last. When the topic of conversation switches to Hardang, Húrin's wrath resurfaces. He tells Manthor, "The voice of your chieftain comes from the shadows, and your folk obey him even in deeds of dishonor and cruelty." To which Manthor replies by hitting the nail of this story on the head. He says, "Hardang is a lesser man than his fathers, but I saw no evil in him till he heard of thy coming. Thou bringest a shadow with thee, Húrin Thalion, in which lesser shadows grow darker." In my mind, that is one of the most crucial lines in this entire story. I think it perfectly illustrates exactly what Morgoth is trying to accomplish with Húrin's freedom. Wherever he goes, other people's shadows grow darker. He's almost like Typhoid Mary, unwittingly infecting everyone around him with the Dark Lord's malice. However, Húrin does not want to hear this. He ends the conversation, but still, Manthor sits with him patiently. And when evening brings darkness into the cave, Manthor orders that a light be brought to Húrin, along with more food. He bids Húrin a good night, and he tells him he will return in the morning. However, when morning comes, Manthor finds that in the night, Húrin's guards have been replaced by unfriendly men of Hardang's household. He demands to see Húrin, but the guards tell him no. Húrin is sleeping. Which is curious. It's mid-morning. Why wouldn't Húrin be awake? Why wouldn't he be expecting Manthor, considering how their conversation ended last night? Well, eventually, Manthor insists on seeing the prisoner, and when he does, he is furious to find that Húrin is now bound not only by chains around his ankles, but also around his wrists. And even when Húrin does wake up, he remains uncharacteristically drowsy. He's simply not himself. He speaks a few words to Manthor, but his eyes soon grow heavy again, and before long he's sleeping again. Manthor doesn't understand, but he takes a piece of Húrin's food, and he sneaks away with it in a fold of his cloak. Anyway, the next day is the day of the folk moot, the day of judgment, the day when almost 1,000 men and women of Brethiel gather at the moot ring. The place is described as a great crescent, with 7 tiers of turf banks rising up from a smooth floor delved back into the hillside. So kind of like a woodland amphitheatre, I guess. A high fence was set all about it, and in the middle of the lower tier of seats was set the Ungbor, or Doom Rock, a great flat stone upon which the Halad would sit. When Hardang Halad enters the moot ring, a great horn silences the assembly. He faces the people of Brethiel and he hallows the moot according to the customs of the Edain, which they learned from the elves. He appeals to Manwe, the king of Arda, and also to Mandos, the lord of doom, fate, and judgment. Then, in the ancient language of the Haladin, which basically no one speaks anymore, he declares that the 301st folk moot of Brethiel has begun. The horn sounds twice, and the prisoner is brought before the ring. It takes 6 men to drag him. They set him violently before the Doom Rock and they hold him there by force. Then Hardang rises. He addresses his people and he recites the charge against Húrin, which allows Manthor his first opportunity to demonstrate exactly how clever of a lawyer he really is. After Hardang says his piece, Manthor approaches the Doom Rock and he says, "By your leave, Lord Halad and folk, as friend to the prisoner, I claim the right to ask, is the charge against him any matter that touches the Halad in person? Has the Halad any grievance against him?" To which Hardang angrily points to the bandage around his forehead from where Húrin threw a stool at him, and he says in no uncertain terms, "Grievance indeed. This is not a new fashion in headgear for the moot. I come here with wounds." Now, if Hardang were a more intelligent chieftain, he would realize that that is exactly what Manthor was hoping he'd say. Hardang has fallen into a trap. Because, according to the law of Brethiel, no man may recite an offense against himself. In other words, if you are the accuser, you can't also be the judge. That's not how justice works. So, Manthor tells the folk someone else is gonna have to preside over the moot, and as Halad, it is up to Hardang to nominate that person. Now, Tolkien explicitly tells us if Hardang had named any of the headmen there present, any of the elders, things might have gone otherwise. But he was in a black anger, and all wisdom failed him. So, in an evil moment, Hardang chose Avranc to take his place as judge. And the reason why this is such a bad idea, Avranc is not a well-liked woodman. He is young, he is scornful, he has not earned this responsibility, and all the elders of the folk moot can now clearly see he was only chosen because he's so pathetically loyal to Hardang. Manthor has already managed to illustrate that neither Hardang nor Avranc have any real interest in justice. They are looking for vengeance. This folk moot may have already been corrupted. But Avranc doesn't see it that way. He takes no heed of the elders' murmured opinions, and he gleefully accepts his role as judge, announcing that this prisoner, this wild man, comes from Angband. He came to Brethiel on an errand, but he's yet to reveal what that errand is. According to Avranc, it must be evil, for he insulted the Halad in his own halls. Then he attempted murder, and for that, the penalty should be death. Now, a few of the younger folk are relatively persuaded by Avranc's prosecution. They have no memory of Húrin's legendary reputation before his 28 years in Angband, and now they believe he is just some madman in league with the orcs. But others are less convinced. Avranc offers Húrin an opportunity to speak on his own behalf, but Húrin refuses to utter anything while he is slave-fettered in chains like a common criminal. So, Manthor states, for the sake of justice, Húrin's bonds must be broken, and he makes such a compelling case that many of the older folk agree. Thus, Avranc has no choice but to strike the shackles from Húrin's hands and feet. And once his limbs are free, Húrin finally responds to Avranc's questions. He says, "For all to hear, I am Húrin Thalion, Lord of Dorlomin, and once a high captain in the host of Fingon. I will not plead before you, neither will I bandy words with the upstart whom you permit to sit in the high seat. Let him lie as he will." Now, in my opinion, that's not a massively unreasonable thing for Húrin to say, all things considered. But unfortunately, for everyone, after that, he keeps going. He insults all the people of Brethiel for wasting their time on a trial while darkness settles about them. He makes no apology for breaking Hardang's head, which he claims was totally justified, and now that he's no longer in chains, he makes it known to the people of the folk moot that they are not quite as safe as they may like to believe. Which I imagine is very annoying for Manthor, the defense attorney. But even after this self-destructive little outburst, Manthor is still able to turn things around. As the folk of Brethiel begin to wonder if Avranc might be right, if they should, perhaps simply execute Húrin and be done with him, Manthor drops a bombshell. He states that on Hardang's order, or perhaps the order of one who is eager to please him, Húrin has been poisoned, and he can prove it. He announces to the folk of the moot that after a coherent and friendly conversation with the accused 2 nights ago, he returned yesterday to find him dulled by drowsiness. So, he secreted away a piece of Húrin's food, and in sight of witnesses, he fed that prison food to one of his hounds. A hound that still lies sleeping as if dead. If the drugged food was intended to keep Húrin docile, then why the need for chains? If the chains were meant to restrain him from violence, what purpose could there be in the poison? Either way, in Hardang's name, an evil deed has been done. Manthor tells the people, "There is malice among us, folk of Brethiel, and I look to the assembly to amend it." Just like that, Hardang and Avranc are now the ones on trial. And just like most guilty people, Avranc's defense is basically no more than an attack on Manthor's character. He tells everyone present to be wary of Manthor's words, for his good faith cannot be trusted. He and the prisoner are akin. Now, I'm sure in Avranc's head he thought that was very wise. He's discrediting the defense. Unfortunately, though, for him, Tolkien tells us these words were unwise. For Manthor responds immediately, "It is so indeed. The mother of Húrin was Hareth, daughter of Halmir, once Halad of Brethiel. But this lineage does not prove me a liar. More, if Húrin of Dorlomin be akin to me, he is kinsman to all the house of Haleth, and all of this folk, yet he is treated as an outlaw, a robber, a wild man without honor." Manthor goes on. He has a whole monologue about Húrin's alleged crime, which can be effectively paraphrased as, yes, he did throw a stool at Hardang's face, but the Halad deserved it. He says to all the people of the moot that Hardang's behavior dishonors his chair, dishonors his hall, and dishonors all the folk of Brethiel. When he says this, the moot ring erupts into an uproar. Under cover of the noise, Hardang moves closer to Avranc, and he tells him he regrets restraining Avranc from murdering Manthor 2 days ago, to which Avranc replies, "I will seek a time yet." Once the shouting dies down, Manthor tells the folk moot they now have 3 options for how to deal with Húrin, the caster of the stool. They could bind him, put a collar around his neck, shut him in a cave, chain him, drug his food, and at last drag him hither to call for his death. That's kind of what they've done so far. Or they could set him free. Or maybe they could beg his forgiveness and command their Halad to do the same. When Manthor says this, the people of Brethiel create a cacophony. Some cry out, "Free! Free! Set him free!" Others shout, "Away with this Halad! Put him in the caves!" Many of the older folk rush forward and they kneel at Húrin's feet. One of them gives him a staff. Another gives him a fair cloak and a great belt of silver. Húrin dons these items, he stands atop the Doom Rock, and he faces the people of Brethiel with the appearance of a king. And so that's it, right? Manthor's just done an extraordinarily good job. The folk have sided with Húrin for the most part, and now the moot can end in justice. Happy days! All Húrin's got to do is not ruin it. Unfortunately, though, that's not what Húrin's best at. Finally, he reveals to the woodmen why he's come here. To the land where his son died, where his daughter died, the land that let Húrin slay the dragon for them, but only sent 2 men to accompany him. A land of cowards, who dared not even help him after his battle with the dragon was won. The land where Morwen lived as a beggar and received no aid, where she perished without food or fire or pity, where she still lies unburied. He points a long hand at Hardang and demands to know, by whose command was she thrust out to starve like a dog? Did your chieftain contrive it? So I believe. Such are his gifts: dishonor, starvation, poison. How long, masters of Brethiel, will you endure him? To suffer this man called Hardang to sit in your chair? Does he deem himself safe? Too often has he called me a wild man. Now he shall see one. Only hands. Hands are needed to wring his throat full of lies. Then Húrin leaps from the stone and strides towards Hardang. Sensing his danger, Hardang orders faithful men about him. They draw their weapons, and for many of Húrin's woodmen, this is seen as an admission of guilt. They draw their weapons, and in the blink of an eye, the hallowed ring of the 301st Folkmoot, this place of justice, becomes ground zero in the Brethiel civil war. Manthor stands between the 2 sides, urging that no blood be shed in their sacred space. But the spark that he himself kindled has burst into a flame that he cannot now quench. Battle breaks out in the ring. Hardang, Avrunk, and their supporters try to escape it, but at the Great Gate, the only way in or out, many men on both sides are slain. Avrunk fights bravely while his Halad retreats, but just before fleeing himself, he draws back his bow and shoots that promised shot at Manthor. The arrow whizzes past Manthor's head and strikes the doom rock beside him, missing its intended target by inches. Next time, nearer, Avrunk says, before running off after Hardang and the rest of his defenders. The Halad makes for the Hall of the Chieftains, half a mile away in Amon or Bel, but they are hotly pursued by Húrin's angry rebels. Before the rebels reach them, Hardang's men seize the hall and they shut it against their enemy. Shortly after, the hall is surrounded and besieged. Once again, Manthor tries to talk sense into the people of Brethiel. He tries to convince them to end this bloodshed, this kinslaying. But as he approaches the hall, hands raised in a show of peace, promising freedom to all people inside if they only lay down their weapons, Avrunk stands in a window and shoots at Manthor again. This time, the arrow brushes past his ear, but once again it fails to kill him. What it does do is inspire even more fury in Húrin's rebels. They rush at the great doors and try to break them down, but in the same moment, Hardang's warriors burst out and his archers rain death upon their own countrymen. Another battle begins, a slaughter in Obel Halad. After many men have died and many others are wounded, the followers of Húrin fall under his mad shadow of wrath. They bring stores of wood and kindling, and they tell Hardang's men in the hall that if they don't surrender by sunset, they will be burned alive. Hardang's response: more arrows shot from more windows, killing anyone and everyone who comes too close. Until, eventually, the sun does indeed set, and under cover of darkness, Húrin's assailants make good on their threat. They set fire to the hall. A few are shot and killed, but before long, the Hall of the Chieftains of Brethiel is ablaze. And as many men burn to death inside, Manthor stands aghast at the ruin of his people and the wickedness of their deeds. He says to himself, "Out of the dark days of our past it comes. A shadow is upon us." And as he speaks these words, he feels a heavy hand on his shoulder, and he sees Húrin standing behind him, grim-faced, staring at the kindling, laughing at the fire. Húrin says that Manthor should now be chieftain, but Manthor replies the folk must choose, and Hardang still lives, to which Húrin tells him, not for long. This is the work of Morgoth. Without even leaving Angband, the Dark Lord has brought ruin to Brethiel. He is wielding Húrin's wrath like a weapon, and now hundreds of woodmen are dead. This is the second great evil that Húrin's freedom achieves. Now, as the fire grows hot in the hall, the Hallad's men begin to panic. Some of them try to extinguish the flames, but when the roof beams ignite, Hardang and Avrank realize their hall cannot be saved. Together, they sneak away out of a rear door, but Húrin's rebels soon find them. Avrank manages to fling himself down, spring back up, and escape into the murky, smoky night, but Hardang is not so lucky. As he runs for his life, a woodman throws a spear at him, and it strikes him right through the back. He falls, mortally wounded. When Hardang looks up, he sees Húrin staring down, a dark shape in the gloom with a light of fire upon his face. And in that face, Hardang sees no pity. He says, "You are mightier than I, Húrin of Hithlum. I had such fear of your shadow that all wisdom forsook me, but now I do not think that any wisdom or mercy would have saved me from you, for you have none. But your last lie against me I cast back upon you ere I die. Never." But before Hardang Hallad can finish his final words, blood gushes from his mouth, and he dies mid-sentence. Manthor and Húrin gaze together upon the Hallad's body, and Manthor regrets all that's happened on this wicked day. Such evil as he wrought did not merit this end. But Húrin disagrees. "He spoke hate from a foul mouth to the last. What lie have I spoken against him?" To which Manthor answers, "The last charge that you brought against him was false, I deem, and he had no chance to deny it." Yes, Hardang was a thoroughly unpleasant person. Yes, he probably did deserve to get a stool thrown at his head. Yes, he did treat Húrin awfully and poison his food, but he was not responsible for what happened to Morwen. She died of grief and despair by the stone of the hapless, and there is nothing Hardang could have done to save her. Manthor explains that Kabed Nairamath was a place so steeped in horror and fear and grief that no woodman has ever set foot there in the 2 years since Turin and Nianor's deaths. No one even knew that Morwen was there. Húrin was wrong to accuse the Hallad of thrusting her out to starve like a dog. That never happened. And so Húrin is forced to reckon with this truth. As the evil day ends, news of Hardang's death spreads throughout all the forest of Brethiel, and the people of the wood look to Manthor, crying that he must now be their new chieftain. But Manthor says no. If he is to succeed his second cousin, he must be elected lawfully by the folk of the moot. He refuses to grab power like an opportunist. Such is his commitment to the customs of his people. However, he does give the woodmen a command. As the new day dawns, he tells them that he will journey to the stone of the hapless to try and make things right. He asks who among them will go with him, and the hearts of many in Brethiel are smote with pity. He gathers a company to go with him, of whom, interestingly, the majority are women, and he sets off with Húrin to do right by Húrin's late wife. When they arrive at the field of burning, they find the body of Morwen lying at the foot of the standing stone where Húrin left her, and they look upon her in wonder, for it seemed to them that they beheld a great queen, whose dignity neither age nor beggary nor all the woe in the world had taken from her, and so they desire to do her honour in death. Some suggest carrying her to the Garth of Graves, to lay her body down among great heroes from the house of Haleth, but Húrin knows that she would have chosen to be buried here, with her son. And so, above the waters of Kabed Nairamath, the women of Brethiel make a grave, and on the standing stone of the hapless they carve the words, "Here lies also Morwen Elethwen." Many woodmen sing sorrowful songs, and as they sing, a grey rain falls about them, swelling the roaring river so that the sound of its waters is like the mourning of many voices. The desolate land becomes heavy with grief, but it is said that after this day, fear left that place, and though it remained leafless and bare, it is no longer a place of dread. Until the very end of Beleriand, women of Brethiel will come here, with flowers in the spring and berries in the autumn, and they will sing sad songs of the grey lady who sought in vain for her son. There is a great deal of darkness in this story, but these glimpses of humanity and hope are, I think, what make it so beautiful. The people of Brethiel have fallen under Húrin's shadow, under Morgoth's shadow, but they are not defined by it. They still show pity, and they still make music, and they still remember what came before. As Húrin looks down at the river Tyrglin, Manthor faces Orbel-Halad, and he says, "I fear that the fire that we kindled is not yet quenched. I must go back swiftly, lest the madness of men bring all of Brethiel to ruin." But as Manthor speaks these words, another arrow comes flying through the trees and strikes his side. His men chase the assassin, but the bowman flees like a deer towards Orbel-Halad, eventually outrunning all pursuers. Yet there can be no mistaking his face. This was Avrunk's doing. His third arrow finally hit true. Manthor falls against a tree, and he sinks to the ground. And while the rest of his woodmen are hunting Avrunk, Húrin stays at his side. He calls him kinsman, and he tells him, "Thou hast been a valiant friend. If the well of my tears were not utterly dried up, I would weep for thee, Manthor, for thou hast saved me from dishonor, and thou hadst love for my son." "Then, Lord," Manthor replies, "use in peace this little more life I have won for thee. Do not bring your shadow upon others." Húrin says farewell, and Manthor dies. I want to take a moment to appreciate this character. He's never ever mentioned in the Silmarillion, and he doesn't appear in any part of the Unfinished Tales, yet in this obscure section of the 11th volume of the History of Middle-earth, we see that not only did he exist, but he was a good man. He lived in a time of fear and foreboding and infighting, yet as darkness took hold in his home, he held on to what he knew was right, and he stood against what was so obviously wrong. He trusted in law and honor and duty. He saw the good and the bad in both friend and foe, and he stood up for the well-being of his countrymen. Now, I should point out, there is some evidence to suggest that if Tolkien had rewritten this story, maybe he was intending to change Manthor's character a bit to make him a little bit more self-serving and power-hungry. It seems Tolkien may have flirted with an idea that everyone in Brethiel should be corrupted by Húrin's shadow, but that's not the version we get. And honestly, I much prefer this version of Manthor as he's written here. In the fleshed-out narrative, he was a good man living through bad times. But speaking of this fleshed-out narrative, after Manthor dies and Húrin finds himself once again alone in Brethiel, Tolkien just kind of stopped. That's it. That is the very abrupt ending to the tale of the Wandering of Húrin. In the words of Christopher Tolkien, "My father never returned to follow the further wanderings. We come here to the furthest point in the narrative of the Elder Days that he reached in his work on the Silmarillion after the completion of The Lord of the Rings. It is as if we come to the brink of a great cliff, and look down from highlands raised in some later age onto an ancient plain far below." This is not the end of Húrin's story, don't worry. I'm not going to conclude this First Age Explained series on such a disappointing note. But to tell the rest of this tale, we must return through more than a quarter of a century to writings Tolkien penned in 1930, before he began work on even The Hobbit. Which means in the next episode, I'm going to have to put away my copy of The War of the Jewels and return once again to the published Silmarillion. And if you're wondering why this newer and fuller version of the story wasn't included in the Silmarillion, I'll let Christopher Tolkien explain that decision in his own words. To have included it, as it seemed to me, would have entailed a huge reduction, indeed an entire retelling of a kind that I did not wish to undertake. And since the story is intricate, I was afraid that this would produce a dense tangle of narrative statement with all the subtlety gone. And above all that, it would diminish the fearful figure of the old man, the great hero Thalion the Steadfast, furthering still the purposes of Morgoth as he was doomed to do. But it seems to me now, many years later, to have been an excessive tampering with my father's actual thought and intention, thus raising the question whether the attempt to make a unified Silmarillion should have been embarked upon. Now, personally, I am enormously thankful that we did get a unified Silmarillion, and the fact that it ends with much older writings than it began with doesn't in any way, I don't think, detract from how epic that ending is. But it's an important reminder. The Silmarillion and the other tales of the Elder Days are a collection of legends. They are not a conventional novel. The vast majority of what we call the Silmarillion was written after The Lord of the Rings, although its stories and characters existed in much older writings dating back to way before even The Hobbit. But the rest of Húrin's tale, as well as the next big story about the Silmaril of Doriath, as well as some, though certainly not all, of the Gondolin story, and the final story of the First Age about the War of Wrath, these were never finished post-Lord of the Rings. The only finished versions that exist in these much older texts. And so, this does result in a few inconsistencies. For example, what happened to Osgon and the other rebels? They were pretty important in this story, but they are never mentioned anywhere in the Silmarillion. Well, I promise you there is a more satisfying answer than simply Tolkien never got round to it, and I'll talk about that at length in the next episode. Do not let me give you the impression things are going to get less interesting now just because we're reading from older writings. One could argue quite the opposite is the case. But this is crucial to understand when explaining Tolkien's Elder Days. The death of Manthor is as far as he got in writing an updated Silmarillion. What comes next is amazingly awesome, but we have to think of it, to use Christopher Tolkien's metaphor, like we are standing on the brink of a newly built cliff, looking down on a much older plain below. Anyway, just before I finish this episode, I will point out that Tolkien did write a few notes on where this story was heading if it had been finished, so there are a few loose ends that can be tied up right now. And I'll start with the fate of Avrunk. After murdering Manthor, he returned to Amon-Obel and took command of the woodmen who'd fought with Hardang. We are told that there was even more fighting there and another great burning, until eventually all was well nigh destroyed. When the madness of these men finally cooled, some of them argued they'd been bewitched, and they blamed Húrin for all the evil they'd partaken in. Eventually, they chose Avrunk to be their new chieftain. But even though this may seem like a disappointingly happy ending for someone as despicable as Avrunk, do not be fooled. There are no happy endings here. We are told Avrunk wielded neither the authority nor the reverence of the chieftains who came before him, and a great many of the people of Brethiel abandoned him, departing the homes of their ancestors and choosing instead to follow the Lady Haleth's only surviving descendant, Lord Húrin himself. And thus, in time, Brethiel was massively depopulated, and the proud culture of the woodmen eventually diminished, and the House of Haleth was reduced to a few small families, scattered and independent, in a forest that grew ever darker and ever more dangerous. And thus, Brethiel was conquered, without Morgoth lifting a finger. But what of the woodmen who went with Húrin? Well, at the crossings of Tyrglin, they are finally reunited with Osgon and his rebels from Dor-lómin. And interestingly, the fugitive woodmen elect Osgon to be their captain. However, whenever any important decisions need to be made, the woodmen look to Osgon, but Osgon ever defers to Húrin. It is Húrin who decides where this company will travel to, and he is the one who leads them to the next stop on his tour of vengeance. Húrin leaves Brethiel with a great force of men, and he guides them into the south, towards the ruins of Nargothrond, where we will see the beginning of the third and final great evil of Húrin's freedom. And that is what I'll talk about in the next episode. So to make sure you don't miss it, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Nevair, Melanine.